All right, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, as you recall. And we've seen that cultures are different, and they're different because of how much of God bleeds into a culture and how much of Satan bleeds into a culture. We're watching Satan bleeding into our culture in the 21st century Western civilization. And that's why it's even more imperative that, as Jesus told Peter, and I think he would say to all pastors, pastor teachers, and whatever, feed my sheep. And you feed the sheep by putting together and expositing biblical truth, book by book, chapter by chapter. You then put together theological constructs so that people understand how all the parts fit together. You correlate the individual parts, and then you have to make ethical decisions. Right? You have to decide things that come up in the midst of the world. And that's where we apply the theological truth that has come from the biblical interpretation. All three are essential. You don't stop at, oh, I heard a good Bible sermon. That's good. But that's not the stop. We've got to put that together with some other things so we have a theological understanding and answer. And then we have to take the next step and say, so what? How does that work? What are the ethical, moral implications of that in my life, in our church, in the culture we live in the country we're inhabiting? How does all of that work? It seems to me that most churches do very little on the ethical side. Perhaps most churches do very little on the theological side. And unfortunately, most churches don't teach the Bible expositionally. Really? Yeah, they don't. So most churches aren't doing any of this, except having a nice little sermonette for Christianettes that don't know what to do at the end of the day. So hopefully that's not true for us, because theology is received from the top down from God, built from the ground up, emanates from the inside out, and is to be submissive always to Holy Scripture. So that's why this is Grace Bible Church, because the Bible is our focal point. But with the Bible as our focal point, we've got to end up coming to some ethical decisions. So what do you do, and how do you decide to do it, and why do you decide what to do and how to do it, right? These are very major problems. Do we think that it's a just war to have with Mr. Putin? Well, that's an ethical decision based on theological things. Should we protect Israel? Well, that's a theological conclusion, which has ethical implications. What kind of protection should we do? Nuclear war, is that allowable? Or does it have to be conventional? These are ethical dilemmas. Now, Paul's not going to deal with that ethical dilemma. He's going to kind of bring one a little bit closer. But as Helicus said, and he was a pastor in Germany during Nazi Germany, he was a Christian, he was against Hitler. His church was totally blown up, bombed out. But he did say, do we not have to accept the fact that under the shadow of forgiveness, different decisions are possible and different loyalties and liberties may exist? And the answer is yes. And that's why you won't find everybody totally agreeing on all of these ethical issues. There are different viewpoints, and we need to be able to hold those, hopefully with a spirit of grace and truth. Now, Paul is going to give us some information about marriage, sexuality, widowhood, virginity, and this morning he's going to talk about divorce. So Paul's not shy. He realizes the church has some issues. In fact, the church wrote to him, so would you please help us understand what these issues, what the answer to some of these issues are. So Paul said, now, concerning what you wrote, let me answer your question. So he's going to go through a series of now concerning. So you wrote, you asked, I'm writing back to you. I'm telling you the answers. This is not seminary class. This is Paul, the pastor, writing a pastoral letter to the normal common person, us. Okay? So this isn't this, whoa, that's way up here. No, it's right down here in the trench where we all live. So don't think this is going to be above us. This is right where Paul wants us to be, and this is what he wants us to understand. So he talks about sexual relations within marriage. Can you believe that? talk about that. Yeah, he talks about celibacy. He's going to talk today about divorce. He's going to talk about the generic principle of stay in your state. If you find yourself a slave, stay there. If you can get free, great. But if you're a slave, stay there. If you find yourself married, great, stay there. If you find yourself not married, stay there. I mean, so there's this general concept coming about. And again, we need to always remember that these are ethical decisions built on theological constructs that come from biblical exposition. All three have to be there most of the time. But we also need to remember that Paul is not giving us a detailed marriage manual. He's not giving us a detailed divorce manual. He's not giving us a detailed anything manual. He's saying, well, now concerning the things you wrote, let me answer your question. So we can begin to understand the questions that they ask by the answers he gives, right? So that's kind of like a mirror view. Well, he's answering what they asked, so we can tell what they asked by the way we get the answers. But he doesn't tell us everything we want to know because we didn't write to him and say, hey, Paul, we got this question. You answer my question. He's answering their questions. Make no mistake, we saw last week, when you basically destroy the foundation and you pervert sexuality, it eventually destroys a culture. Okay? That's what's going to happen. That's where too much of the devil bleeds up and not enough of God bleeds down to form a culture. We are watching our culture totally flip, totally change. Read the paper today. Here we have the homosexual and the whatever running for the mayoral race. I forget what the county was, but you have these three people. This is the first openly declared LGBTQ, and this. Yeah, well, this is what's happening in our world. Everything's getting changed. And we might want to go run and just hide in the Christian ghetto and say, well, I don't want to see anything. We can't do that. We have to be what? Jesus said, you're supposed to be the salt and the light. You're supposed to expose the darkness, Paul said. We're supposed to be engaged. I'm not telling you how you're to be engaged. I'm just saying we're all supposed to be engaged. You ask God, say, Lord, how should I be engaged? Should I be engaged feeding the poor? Should I be engaged helping the homeless? Should I be engaged? Whatever that is, I'm not telling you what it is. I'm just saying, how are you going to be salt and light? So this morning, Paul is going to talk about the issue of divorce. He's not going to tell us everything about it, but he is going to talk to us about it. This has been a very large question in the history of the church from the very beginning. I mean, day one. It's been a very big issue at Grace Bible Church. Some of you may not be old enough, or you may not have been here long enough, but this is a church that had a very long history, and sometimes rocky history, with the issue of divorce, remarriage, and how that plays out. And some of you are going, really? Yeah. So we'll see a little bit of that here in a minute. So here's some questions. Is it ever allowed in the Bible, divorce? Does someone say, no, absolutely not? Well, let's see. What about divorce if you were married to a non-Christian? If it's not, then how do we treat a divorced person in the church? How do we treat them? Well, they can't serve in the church, but they can come and listen to the sermon. Well, can they be a greeter? Oh, absolutely not. Can they teach Sunday school? Heaven forbid. Can they be helping in the parking? No. But that's one view, right? That's a pretty strong view. That was, I think, Dr. Pentecost view taught for a number of years. They could come and listen to him preach, but they couldn't do anything else. That's pretty severe. Well, then what about remarriage? Is there any grounds for divorce? Is there any then grounds under that for remarriage? And can a divorced man become an elder? Many churches would say absolutely not. Some churches would say yes. So, at any rate, this is a pretty complicated topic. It's an ethical topic built on theology coming from this exposition of the scripture. So, you have a couple of handouts. Take the first one, the divorce question. Right? That's a 2-pager that's there. So, obviously, from a societal perspective, divorce used to be looked at as a big taboo. Right? Remember Sigmund Freud, totem and taboo? He wrote about the taboos and the totem poles and all the things that were negative in the culture. Well, divorce used to be a negative taboo, but now it's normalized. Right? So our whole society has changed in this view of divorce, but it's because of their view of sexuality and it's because of their view of marriage. So all of these things have changed, not just the divorce question. Everything's got to change. From a spiritual perspective, this has put the church in a problem because the church isn't sure what to do with it. Some churches just say, well, let's just not allow it, and that's just the easy way to go. And then others have said, well, that's a cop-out. We need to deal with what the scriptures actually say, and we need to try to be open and fair, and if it's unclear, then we need to be offer a little more balance. But this can take place in the life of individuals, and it can be totally traumatic in families, or this can take place in the life of the church. And that has happened both in our church, the individuals here, and as a church as a whole. So I'm sure somebody asked me, said, well, do you think you'll offend anybody when you talk about this? I said, oh, no, I'm sure I'll offend everybody. I mean, equal opportunity offense. So I know that some people here in our church are divorced. I know some have family that are divorced. And so I'm not trying to speak to you. I'm not trying to speak to your situation. I'm not singling you out. That's just a reality. Okay? I get that. So moral dilemmas. In a fallen world, definitely we're there are moral dilemmas. With moral dilemmas, there'll be multiple options. Often there's a biblical defense for more than one option. And there are real moral choices that need to be made, but that does not mean that people always hold to the same answer. Okay? So, cut each other some slack. How about that? That's him. Be gracious to one another because you probably all don't hold the same view. And that's okay. That's up to you. You're free to do that. But let's be kind about it. So let's talk about some of the views. Real quick, one of the views, the very restrictive view, would be simply never. Divorce is never allowed. It's never right. It's never proper. Never. And the text for that would come from, say, places like Matthew 5 and 19, where Jesus gives twice talk about divorce. And the question is, does he give an exemption or an exception for it? And this group would say, no, never, ever. And they have ways of getting that. Malachi chapter 2. I hate divorce, God says. Well, if he hates divorce, then he certainly doesn't allow it, some would say. Genesis 1 and 2. You shall be one flesh. And what God's put together, let no man put asunder. So, okay, never ever divorce. That was the position of Grace Bible Church under Dr. Pentecost. And he had his reasons. Some of the reasons are theological. One would be the covenant realization, held most well known to be Carl Laney. And that is, there's a one flesh relationship. There's a covenant. It cannot be broken, period. Now, there's a guy named Bill Heff. Bill Heff went to Dallas Seminary. He wrote his master's thesis on divorce. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on divorce. He wrote the best book ever written on his position on divorce. He taught this. He taught it. He still teaches at Taylor University. And this was his view, and he was world-renowned for his book, his viewpoint, and whatever. No divorce ever, and of course, no remarriage ever. Then one day I was in the library when I was at Phoenix Seminary. I saw this. I looked at journals, kind of stay up to speed what's going on. All of a sudden, here's this thing that said, "Why I changed my mind." Well, yeah. So I read that and I went, whoop. So I went upstairs to one of our other professors who I knew was interested in this topic because he taught ethics. And I said, "Do you see this?" He looked at me and went, "Oh!" And it just a total change. Well, then I saw Bill at a meeting, theological meeting, and I said, "Why did you change your mind?" I knew because I read the article. He basically changed his mind because he finally realized that, well, maybe the one flesh could be broken. That covenant could be broken by sexual sin because it's sexual connection that is what makes the one flesh. Therefore, sexual perversion might be allowable to break the one flesh. And I'm sitting there scratching my head going, I think I wrote a paper on that 20 years ago, and you graded it, because he graded every paper at Dallas Seminary on this topic. And he gave me an A, even though he wrote, billions of markings in red and whatever. But, wow, this guy, total. Now, all that's great. He's a wonderful guy, good man, godly man. And my thought was, how many lives has this man messed up? Assuming now that he's right, and then at first he was wrong, think of all the advice he gave people and the impact that had. And he is not a bad man at all. That's not it. He genuinely believed this view, and now he genuinely believes this view, but all the people he influenced with the wrong view, in his new view, from his new perspective, those people are harmed. Which may be why James says, let not many of you become teachers. Anyway, there's also the betrothal view. And this is held by Dr. Pentecost, or it was while he was alive, John Piper, famous guy, he holds it, Bill Yarder, disciple of Dr. Pentecost, and many other people would say simply, well, wait a minute, divorce in Matthew 5 and 19 is only talking about not a marriage, but a betrothal marriage. And since we don't have betrothal marriages anymore, that was a Jewish thing, therefore, what Jesus was talking about has no application at all. It's not existing. Therefore, no divorce, because that's the only place you find an exception for divorce. Interesting.
Could you explain for the few of us who don't understand what a local marriage is?
Yeah, so it's like a very tight engagement, right? So you're betrothed to somebody, you stay engaged for a while, but they talk about you as if you're married. You're not, but you are. And so Jesus was talking about that, they would say, not the real consummated marriage. So it's kind of a heavy engagement there. So based on this view, now I'll tell you a story. I was at Dallas Seminary, I was doing some research, and I went and talked to one of the professors, and it was not quite Pentecost. But I went and talked to him because he held to the betrothal view. I said, well, let me tell you a story. So what happens if there's two people married, they're Christians, and they divorce, okay? And then this guy gets remarried, and he has 10 children. I'm just making it up. He has 10 children. And 20 years later, his former wife comes back and says, oh, I made a mistake. I want to be married to you. You're my husband. I said to my friend, what should this man do who's divorced from her, married to her, and has 10 kids? What should she do? What should he do? He should stay with his second wife for the sake of the kids. I said, that's just total hypocrisy. That's foolishness, saying this to my professor. And he looked at me like, why? I said, well, in your view, this man was never divorced. There is no divorce in your view. Therefore, he never got remarried because he was never divorced. He was always married to her. He didn't get remarried. He's simply been committing adultery all this time. And you're telling him to stay in an adulterous relationship. I said, that's the problem with your view. It doesn't work in real life. He said, well, yeah, that is a hard one. But trust me, I didn't change his view. So a third option is what is called a Levirate marriage view. Back in Leviticus 18:6, it says don't marry a near relative. So, and there's a whole lot of other interesting laws in Leviticus 18 that I'm not going to go through, but this would be the view of Charles Ryrie, which I think we all know, and Walt Kaiser. And so therefore, once again, this is a Jewish thing. And Matthew 5 and 19 are Jewish things. And so Dr. Ryrie would say what Matthew was recording that Jesus said was a unique Jewish thing that no longer exists. Therefore, there still now is no divorce because the one reason for divorce was only a Jewish thing that no longer exists. So that's taken off the table. So never, for a variety of reasons. Now, the liberal view is always. Whether it's, biblical reasons, they would just say, well, but the Bible's old, it doesn't really apply to today. Or sociological reasons, well, people are people today, and that's what we're going to do. So just go with it. Right? Bend the Bible, don't believe the Bible, reinterpret the Bible. We're not going to do it. Next page, the conditional view. Only if. So some would say only if adultery, based on Matthew 5. Or it's not really the word adultery there, it's the word porneia, so that would allow for homosexuality, bestiality, or some other indecent thing, whatever that is. This is a view that was started by Erasmus back in the Enlightenment, right, back during Reformational time. And then John Murray is probably the most famous. John Frame, this is actually partially held in the Westminster Confession, right? They hold to some other things too, but it is there. So adultery, or only if desertion. And of course, this would be desertion to, if you were married to if the Christian was deserted by the non-Christian partner, then that would constitute the ability to be divorced. And a number of people would hold that. And then the third would be if there's physical harm. So if there's physical harm, then a person has a right to not stay married. Many would hold that. And then some would say pornography or internet addiction. Now, of course, I'm not sure how much addiction is addiction, right? Is it a lot? Is it a little? At any rate. So these are kind of the exceptions people would have for divorce. And I imagine that most of us are somewhere in this listing, right? Either never, for theological reasons, or only if. Now, we're not going to have a test at the end, and you don't have to tell everybody, but you do need to at least be honest enough to say, well, I think I'm over here, or I think I'm over here, and be good with it. So, we want to look at some of these views. So turn over to the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew chapter 5. We find this in chapter 5 and chapter 19. Verse 31. And this is part of the unique sermon of Jesus, right? Sermon on the Mount. Verse 31, and it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Well, who said that? Well, Moses said that in Deuteronomy 24. But I say, so we see this pattern. Well, someone said this, but I say this. Moses, the lawgiver, said this, but I'm the second lawgiver. I say this. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, now the next word is except for the cause of porneia, some translated unchastity, some translated sexual sin, keep it vague, but it doesn't say adultery. But except for the cause of porneia, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So, big picture here, many would go to this passage and say, this is talking about betrothal, so it doesn't enter into our discussion. This is talking about a levirate marriage, so it doesn't enter into the discussion. But if it is not those, and it is entering into the discussion, then it seems to say that no divorce except for the cause of porneia, some sort of sexual sin, breaks the one flesh relationship. So we have this exception clause that's given to us. So it kind of depends on your predisposition, and it depends then on how you're going to interpret this passage. Very, very important passage. And we could do the same in chapter 19, where it's given there. As you notice, Jesus was quoting Deuteronomy 24. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency. Now, nobody knows what the indecency is, but it seems to be tied to some kind of sexual perversion. If he finds some indecency in her, then he writes her a certificate of divorce or a bill of divorcement and puts it in her hand. And that's important. You got to put it in the hand to make it a binding, thing. You went to the plaintiff or whatever and you put it in their hand. And sends her away from his house, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And the later husband turns against her, writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her away from his house. Or if the latter husband who took her to be his wife dies, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. And this is very convoluted. Basically, it's trying to protect the wife thrown off to the whatever, and then some can't come back to the first husband because that would be impure. But the main thing is, it seems like there's a bill of divorcement that's allowed for some indecency that is found. You see something not quite the same, but you do see the terminology here. God says if a husband divorces his wife and she leaves him and becomes another man's wife, will he return to her again? Would that land not be completely defiled? That seems to be building off of Deuteronomy 24. The point is, there seems to be an allowance for a bill of divorcement that actually breaks the marriage. And it seems to be tied to some sort of sex sin. We go to Malachi in the Old Testament, I hate divorce. But it's interesting that twice it's connected with the word treacherous. Treacherous divorce. Treachery. This would be the view that Mike Fisher holds. He looks at Malachi and he says, God hates divorce, but it's tied to the treachery of the men who were manipulating and harming their wives. They were being treacherous. So that's the kind of divorce that God hates. Others would say God hates all divorce. You could look at Ezra 7. Excuse me, not Ezra 7, Ezra 10. I didn't put the quote up, but you might want to look at it. Ezra chapter 10, verse 11 and 12. Let me read this to you. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, you have been unfaithful and have married foreign wives, adding to the guilt of Israel. Now, therefore, make confession to the Lord God of your fathers and do his will, and separate yourselves from the peoples of the land and from your foreign wives. So here are people who are being instructed by God to divorce their wives. You say, well, they're foreign wives. Well, yeah, but they're wives. Now, I never even saw this passage until one day I was in the office of Alan Ross, and we were, he taught Hebrew there, and so we were talking about a variety of topics and some ethical topics and stuff. And so, I was talking about divorce to him, and he said, well, he said, I think he put it this way, if Dr. Ryer's right, why does Ezra command people to get divorced? I said, where's he do that? He said, Ezra 10, haven't you ever read it? Oh, dumb on me. So we looked at it and said, oh, I didn't know that was there. He says, you need to read your Bible. So, I repent. Look over at Romans chapter 7. Any theology of divorce has got to take into consideration Romans chapter 7, verses 1 and follow. Chapter 7, Romans. Or do you not know, brethren, where I'm speaking to those who know the law, that the law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives? For the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning the husband. Okay, that's clear. So then, if while her husband is living, she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man. So here Paul is saying, hey, he's got to die for you to be free. If he's not dead, you're still married. If you marry somebody else or connect with somebody else, you just committed adultery because there's no divorce, according to Paul. Now, the answer to that could be, well, Paul is using that as a case study illustration. And so he's not actually quoting Jesus, but he is giving kind of a general case law. And then finally, over in 1 Corinthians, where we are today, chapter 7, verses 10 to 16, we're going to take a look at this here in a minute. But some other questions that come into play. Is there an innocent party, which would allow for the innocent party to be divorced? And would that perhaps include remarriage? What if all this took place before a person was a Christian? They got divorced before they were a believer. Now they're a believer and can they get married? Some would say no. Others would say yes because they were divorced before the marriage or before the conversion. So this is what pastors have to wrestle with. How do we protect the flock from unbiblical teaching? How do we keep the flock pure by biblical teaching? And it is a very difficult thing to do. And then, of course, the question about divorce and leadership. Can a divorced person be an elder? Can a divorced person be a deacon? Can a divorced person teach Sunday school? Can a divorced person be on whatever auxiliary group there is? Or, you just kind of go down the list, and this is what pastor teachers have to decide. This is what elder boards have to decide. And our church has been through a pretty long history of trying to decide that. So take the other hand out, right? Which is here getting more towards the passage of the day. So we've seen last week how Paul talks about Christian life and marriage. He gave us some principle to understand about sexuality, and now he's going to kind of move into the very specific area about divorce. So let me read it so we kind of get the context here, starting in verse 8. But I say to the unmarried and the widows that it's good if they remain as even as I am. But if they don't have self-control, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn. Okay, that's how we finished last week. Let's put that together. But to the married, new category, new group. But to the married, I give instructions, not I, but the Lord. Meaning, Jesus talked about divorce, and so Paul's kind of bringing some of that to bear. So he's saying, this isn't me, this is coming from Jesus. He says, but to the married I give instruction, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not send away the wife. So, don't leave would be the message. If you leave, you stay unmarried. Does that assume they're divorced? Because he said they're unmarried. Does that assume there was a divorce that took place? He doesn't say. Be reconciled to her husband. Does that imply she's still married? Even if they're divorced or been separated. But the husband's not to send away the wife. So here I take it Paul's giving instructions about Christians, and he's saying don't divorce. Now, does this counteract what you find in Matthew 5 and 19? Some would say Matthew 5 and 19 don't talk about divorce in the church. They talk about Judaism. Therefore, Jesus never gave an exception. Therefore, what Paul says stands as an absolute no divorce ever under any circumstances. And that is an evangelical position that many people would hold. So it's kind of a challenge, shall we say. So but Christians live in a culture and things get corrupted and messed up. What if a Christian conversion comes after the marriage to a non-believer? This is the city of Corinth. People were married, but then people became believers. What do I do now, Paul? I have a feeling they wrote him. This is one of the things that he wrote. They're going, well, do I stay in it? Do I go? Do I let him or her go? What should I do, Paul? Well, Paul's going to tell us. But to the rest, verse 12, but to the rest I say, not the Lord. Wait a minute. I say, not the Lord. Yeah, Paul's saying the Lord didn't talk about this topic, but I am. That doesn't mean it's not authoritative. It just means the Lord didn't talk about this, but I am, and I'm still the apostle writing and answering your question. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, okay, so we got a Christian married to a non-Christian unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, let him not send her away. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, let her not send her husband away. So this is kind of an interesting scenario. We've got the brother and the wife, and then we got the wife and the husband. They're kind of inverted there. And then we got the husband and the wife and the brother. So Paul kind of rhythmically puts this together and says, okay, you're married. Here's the believer, finds himself now married, still married, but now this guy's a non-believer and the lady converted to Christ. So we have this mixed marriage. What do we do? Paul says, don't send them away. Stay in your state. That's not a bad thing. So Paul's going to give us a reason. Verse 14, for, here's the explanation. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified, made holy, right? The unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife. And the unbelieving wife is made holy through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children are unclean, but now they are holy. So the believing man sanctifies the unbelieving wife, or the believing wife sanctifies the non-believing husband, makes them holy. Otherwise, logical inference here, the children are unclean, but now they are holy. What in the world does that mean? So let me give you some options. You like options. Carl Laney argues that a pagan partner, a mixed marriage, is set apart to receive a Christian witness and influence that he or she might not otherwise have. So don't divorce, don't leave, because you might have an influence on your non-Christian partner. Evangelism. He's not saying you Christians go marry non-Christians. No, he's saying you became a Christian, but you're already married to a non-Christian. Stay and you can do evangelism. Gordon Fee concurs by maintaining the marriage, they improve the potential of leading the unbeliever to salvation. Possible. Others contend that Paul assumes that the unbelieving partner who is willing to continue the marriage to the Christian is somehow made a part of the Christian's covenantal status. Mine's kind of by proxy. They are consecrated by the conjugal bond that unites the couple. In this case, the spouse's membership in the church brings the unbelieving spouse into association with the church. Well, I agree, it brings them into association with the church, but it doesn't kind of rub off onto them. So I don't think I'd go with Dr. Boudet. Paul's not arguing for sanctification by proxy, but making an argument against divorce. His basic argument is this: mixed marriages have the same status as Christian marriages and should not be abandoned. Continuing the marriage accords with God's design for marriage and should be hallowed as a sphere in which God's holiness and transforming power operate. Okay, I mean, it's good, right? But Paul, is it still okay if they leave? Can I be divorced? Can I be separated? Can I get remarried? The question is still on the table. Anyway, let's get to that before we run out of time. Verse 15. Yet, if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage. Now, listen to the next three words. In such cases, plural. In such cases. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave, for the brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, a wife, whether you will save your husband? How do you know, a husband, you'll save your wife? Wait a minute, Paul. If they stay, you said I'm going to have an impact on them. Yes, you might, but you don't know that for sure. So if they leave, you're not under bondage to them. Only as the Lord is assigned to each one, as God has called each in this manner, let him walk, and thus I direct all the churches. So Paul says, this isn't just for you. This is a teaching I give to everybody. So the brother or sister is not under bondage. They're not enslaved. And you're going to see this slavery language kind of later on in the chapter, as well as the word called. At any rate, you're not in bondage in cases like this. Are there other cases? Are there other cases that could also be called to allow the unbelieving spouse to leave? What would those cases be? I don't know. We might look at it. So the wife is not bound to the marriage. Does that mean they're free to remarry? Does that mean they're actually divorced? They're not bound, they're divorced, so they're free to get remarried. Does desertion break marriage bond and the one flesh relationship? Not bound, does that mean define or chase the spouse? Does it mean you're actually divorced? Or does it mean you don't have to run after them, but you're still not divorced and you can't remarry? So these are all the questions that are kind of floating around the topic. So what might be the other cases that Paul has in mind that might be allowable? Can a believer leave the unbeliever if the unbeliever does some of these things? Physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, addicted to pornography or gambling or alcohol. And that leads to other things, wasting all the money, intimidation, bullying, fear. Now some would say, no, there is no divorce, no remarriage. Stay married to the drunken guy who's beating you up. This is where the ministry of eldering comes in. The elders need to go visit that person and beat the snot out of them and help them have a higher sense of reality. That's what it's up. No. Others would say, you're not bound, but you're still married. Others would say, you're not bound, you're free to be divorced, and you're free to remarry. But what cases allow for that? Is it just desertion? What if they stay, but they've deserted you because they've spent all the money, they physically abuse you, sexually abuse you, do a number of other things? They basically deserted the one flesh relationship. They've deserted to honor and love you that you promised at the wedding. All of that's been broken. Does that create the kind of situation where divorce is allowable? So, in the evangelical church, let me just summarize this. In the evangelical church, there are more and more who are finding other cases to be allowable for divorce. Illustration, Dr. Wayne Grudem, who I taught with for a number of years at Phoenix Seminary, he wrote a book on Christian ethics. It's a marvelous book. If you got some money, go buy it. It's big, it's thick, but it says everything about everything on most everything. Really well written, really well documented. I don't agree with you on a couple of things theologically, but in terms of the ethics book, fabulous. The book comes out. Like in 3 months, he changed his view on divorce and remarriage and gave a talk at the Evangelical Theological Society. So I got the notes. What are you doing? You changed it pretty quick. So I got the notes, and so I give the notes to my class that I teach because I use this book and I want to make sure they understand. Here's his new view, okay? But he is allowing for more cases. And this is a very, very conservative evangelical theologian who is now at 71 years old realizing that there are other cases. Bill Heff realized there were different cases. So the evangelical landscape is changing. They're adjusting. They're broadening. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's what's happened. Yeah.
I have a hermeneutical question. In the non-believing spouse leaving, to me that implies a physical separation. He left physically.
Yeah.
In some of these other cases, pornography, sexual, it's an emotional, well, they're staying, but they've emotionally separated. Hermeneutically, can you say that emotionally being separated is the same as physically being separated?
Yeah, and that's what some of these evangelicals are saying, that you've deserted the relationship, either physically or emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. You're there, but you're not there. Right. Yeah, you're in the house, but you're not there. And when you are there, you're drunk. When you are there, you're dangerous. When you are there, you're harming me. When you are there, you're hitting the kid, and all that's taking place. So they would say that's justifiable.
But is that a valid interpretation?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think it's a valid. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just saying I see how they get there.
Okay, I'm asking whether you agree with it or not.
Yes, Judy!
I'm missing one big thing here. And that is where the grace and forgiveness and repentance come in. And is divorce an unforgivable sin?
So we'll start at the back end. Is divorce an unforgivable sin? No, because there's no unforgivable sin except the sin against blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, which actually can't be committed today. That's another question. So no, it's not the unforgivable sin. What does a person do if they're divorced for, say, a non-biblical reason? They get remarried. Is that a real marriage? Or are they obligated to go back 10 years later to their first wife? Some would say it's not a divorce, so it's not a real
Can't
marriage.
go back.
They can't go back at that point.
Right, and Deuteronomy would say you shouldn't, principles say you shouldn't go back. But no, they could go back. Dr. Pentecost would say, they never got divorced, they never got a new marriage, therefore they're still married over here, therefore anytime they should have the opportunity, they should go back. Even if they now have 10 kids, that's a problem.
I think Paul's saying here, he's given us a mission statement, that you stay committed with agape love to your wife, covenant love, no matter what. And the world now is telling people, well, if it doesn't go good and you fall out of love and your wife's getting you a problem, get a divorce, and that's what the church is taking on. But I think you got to have the mission statement. You got to disciple young people that this is your mission statement. You don't plan on any kind of divorce in the future.
I would agree with all that, but I would add, but Paul seems to be giving permission for something. So he would probably affirm everything you said, but the Corinthians were writing and saying, but what about this? And Paul writes back and says, desertion, depending on your interpretation, if a non-believer deserts, then you are permitted to divorce and remarry. Now, one other caveat here. You all remember Jay Adams? Jay Adams was a Presbyterian, he wrote a book called The Big Umbrella. He was a counseling guru, good guy. And he came up with a view that said this. So you have these two Christians that are married, and this Christian deserts his wife. A real Christian would not desert his wife. Therefore, he's not a real Christian. Therefore, she was married to a non-Christian. Now she's able to be divorced.
Oh,
I'm serious. It's exactly what it is. Now you can see where that goes. Then all of a sudden, anytime a divorce happens, you're going to basically, he must not be a believer. So I'm free to remarry. I mean, I remember reading that years ago going, oh my gosh, that's just an open-ended mess. And Dr. Grudem does not hold to that directly, but indirectly, that's kind of where it goes. Part of this is found in a little bit in the Westminster Confession, but it's also found in the modern Presbyterian write-up about divorce and remarriage. They tend to go a little bit this way, so it's not interesting. Bob?
Yeah, Believers Chapel wouldn't accept the donation because the person that gave it was divorced.
Really?
So they said, so they reasoned that he must not be saved.
Well, there we go.
I have a question.
There we go.
Is lack of financial support desertion?
Well,
How do you define lack of financial support?
basically not taking care of the spouse. So you're the man, you're working, but you don't give her any money, you don't feed her, you don't. Well, the Old Testament's interesting because, and the rabbinical stuff is interesting because it talks about somebody being married, if you don't give them their conjugal rights or their food, you're a bad person and open to being penalized. So the lack of financial support was a real thing. I suppose you could say that's a form of desertion, especially if it's harming you physically, let alone emotionally and psychologically. Yeah, I think a form of desertion. Somebody had their hand up over there? Yeah.
Practical application question, maybe.
Yeah.
So if you think about the statement, God hates divorce,
Malachi 2. Yeah.
I'm with you on that. But the Bible is so clear about so many things, and yet on this seems to be somewhat ambiguous, or there's lots of interpretations. And it seems like that if scholars or just us, if you're niggling for this or that, or does this apply, or how does that apply? It seems like that if the guiding principle, if you go back to the guiding principle, God hates divorce, right? And you accept it as a covenant between you and God, that should be your guiding principle. And all these other things, life happens, right? But then also, to Judy's point, forgiveness comes in there too. And so, it seems like if you're trying to get out of it, that's the wrong approach to take. But you need to keep the center. God hates it, but sometimes it happens. And then I agree that the church needs to decide how does that, work in our, who teaches, who doesn't, and stuff. But, I don't think there's the penalty or, there should be a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so the principle is pretty biblical, we got it, but there are problems that come about, and that's why Jesus said, it was Matthew 19, Moses permitted divorce because of the what? Hardness of your heart. So at the bottom line, this is a sin problem of all humanity, and again, you're going to find people who are going to say, well, I think there's no divorce. Jesus said so, that's it. End of story. I don't want to have to mess with this anymore. And others would say, if there's so many exceptions or places where it's unclear, we better err on the side of grace and let people have their own conscience lead them. But you got to run a church. You have to have policies and procedures and based on theology. That's where it becomes tricky. And that's where we need to speak the truth in love, but we got to be balanced with grace and truth. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And our church is a classic example of how it was in the 1960s versus how it then came from the 80s, 90s, and where it is now. There's been transition. Some people have thought that's liberalism, others have thought that's realism. Anyway, Paul was asked these questions. Paul answers these questions. These are normal questions inside the church. These are the things every church should be preaching on, teaching on, writing on papers on, so that the congregation understands. Because we move from what? We move from exposition to theological, ethical activity. We have to do that. And more so than ever in a post-Christian America, where what used to be nailed down, everything's coming unglued. Right? Everything's coming unglued. That's why we need to know this even more. Lord in heaven, these are hard things. So we pray that you would illuminate us to truth, help us know how to apply it in our life, help us to know how to encourage others in their life. And Lord, help us be filled with grace and truth as we speak truth in love. In Christ's